Every once in a while, a politician changes parties. They'd previously identified as a Democrat or Republican, then they decide something happened that forces them to switch over. And sometimes that is an incredibly consequential thing. We had talked earlier this year in North Carolina about a Democrat swapping over that not only changed the results for the legislature, giving the Republicans a supermajority, but that allowed them to override the veto of the Democratic governor on an anti-abortion bill. And now some in North Carolina don't want to have to deal with that in the future. So they've got this bill, Senate Bill 748, would require candidates who do a party switcheroo, they say, early in their terms to be removed from office and refund their donors. It's called the Voter Fraud Prevention Act. And basically what it would do is it would require that when a member of the General Assembly switches parties with more than 6 months left on his or her term, that the seat is considered to have been vacated, triggering a special election within 90 days. That official also would have to refund campaign contributions to any donor who requests them. So they would both lose their position, like they can do their, let's say that it's a principle that's causing them to swap parties, as if that would ever be the case. But let's say it is. Then they can switch, but they don't necessarily get to keep the same seat that they ran for based on a false idea of which party they would be representing, and all of the money that they could raise, which could be a significant sum from their constituents who probably at that point feel like they were defrauded, would be able to get it back. I've never heard of this sort of thing before, JR. What do you make of this?
It seems like something that maybe has some good elements for the possibility of maybe deterring people from doing this for political purposes outside of principles, as you said. But it's hard whenever it comes to these hardline things, like with 6 months left. So if somebody's planning this, they'll wait until there's under 6 months left. There's always ways around things when you have a hard deadline before someone can do something. So they'll plan with it in some kind of way there. Because again, it's about power, money, positions, political, expediency and all this stuff. So they'll find a way. So that's the one problem I maybe have with it. I get the idea of wanting to do this, because look, it completely flips everything that what constituents thought they were getting. It's why when someone wins an election, we heard people, even though they have like, a couple seat majority, they'd be like, mandate, because they talk about all things that they can do now. And they think that can influence constituents to believe that, this is what the majority of people wanted. Now, when it flips simply because one or two or however many people wanted to do that once they're in office, this completely changes democracy on its head for what is it that people want. But I also don't want to take away people's possibility of then, of course, based off of principle and just who they are, switching parties because their party got away from them. It could happen with Republicans, it's just that they're too afraid to. There's plenty of Republicans that hate where the party's gone, but they don't say it. And one thing they're definitely not gonna do is switch parties, because then they find themselves kind of in no man's land. A lot of times, if people are starting to feel disenfranchised from their party, they may shift more middle, but it doesn't mean they're gonna go so far as to complete who they've completely disagreed with. If the Democratic Party, and I'm an elected official, has been doing things completely different than I wanted, I can never find myself then going, everything that those Republicans have been saying suddenly makes sense to me, because they don't. They just wouldn't. It never would happen that way. So it's hard to really find yourself switching with it being based on principle anyway, because that means every principle that you had wasn't in existence anymore. I don't know, man. It seems like a non-answer for me, but it just seems like it's hard to really pin this down.
Yeah, it's tough, like on principle, but then also tough in implementation. So, like, if you could make it so that this works, should you have that? I don't know. Automatically being like, there could be situations in which the actual principled thing to do would be to swap. But then also when you talk about the implementation, so this is basically a reaction to Representative Tricia Cotham, who swapped over, and even though she had been a Democrat for years and years, ran for multiple positions in government as a Democrat, said that she was for reproductive rights, swaps over not only to vote to take away those rights, but to override a Democratic governor's veto. That's insane. That is obviously a betrayal of her voters and of her donors. I don't think that any reasonable person can say anything else. They were not ambiguous about what their positions were. This was not a steady, slow change over time. You just ran as a Democrat and got all these donations. It's an obvious betrayal. It's an intentional betrayal. For what remains to be seen. That's an interesting question. I would love to know. But if switching parties gets you immediately kicked out, then they won't switch parties. They'll just vote for the other side, even though they're still it doesn't actually, I don't think, in practice work. What I think makes more sense is you need to have some sort of way, not that they would automatically get kicked out, but that perhaps it would trigger, like a potential recall vote. Like you 30 days later or 60 days later, you have a vote to recall them. The issue with that is then if it was triggered by them switching parties, then again, they just wouldn't switch parties.
Exactly.
And if you just always had the capacity to trigger recalls, I think that there should be a system for recalls. I think that Kyrsten Sinema is a great example of why that would be a good thing. But then we also know that that sort of thing can and is gamed. In California here, it's gamed constantly to do pointless recalls that aren't actually supported by the people. So it is a difficult thing to fix, but I definitely I think it's something that we need to continue to think about because this is not super rare that this happens. Like we've seen this before. Kyrsten Sinema is a great example of it. So I don't know.
It's hard.
I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, it's hard because I was thinking even just, you have to complete your term and then switch parties and run again. But then that's still tough too because as you said, they'll just sit back and stay within the party and sabotage.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say though, while I don't have the solution, I can say that I utterly despise many of these instances of this. In some cases, I also hate when people run, lose, and then decide, I'm just gonna run as an independent, even though I've been rejected. I'm just gonna try to ruin it for the party that rejected me. I hate that too. I come from Connecticut. I experienced that with Lieberman.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.